Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever you might be, and welcome to The Turn, from reactionary populism to a progressive alternative, with Professor Jeffrey Sachs and Roberto Mangabeira Unger. My name is Florencia Liberty. I'm the head of program and partnership at the SDG Academy, and we are truly delighted to present you with this three-part webinar series to discuss the systemic and structural changes necessary to create a progressive future. These three series today, Stagnant and Divided, what happened to socially inclusive economic growth and progressive politics. The second will be Losing and Finding the Way, the United States and Brazil, which will take place next Friday, 26 at the same time. And session 3 will be From Now to an Alternative, the Missing Project, and will take place the following Friday, 2nd of April, at the same time as well. As our global audience joins the webinar, I'd like to remind you that you will all be able to submit your questions in the Q&A feature of the platform, and they will be addressed by Professor Jeffrey Sachs and Roberto Mangabeira Unger after their lecture during the Q&A section. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it to Professor Jeffrey Sachs so he can get us started on the first of these three sessions. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Great, thank you, Florencia, and thanks to the SDG Academy for hosting these three sessions, and thanks to my dear friend and longtime colleague, Roberto Unger, for conceiving this series and inviting me to join him in a brainstorming on what's happened to our world, and two countries that we're going to focus on in particular that have had very strange and difficult politics in recent years, Brazil and the United States. But these are cases that show larger patterns and challenges for our world. At various times during the past 25 years, when the world has been strange and faced important choices and crises, Roberto Unger and I have taught together in a kind of dialectical approach where we each give presentations, discuss amongst ourselves, and then open it up to the class. This time we're opening it up to the world class. We're delighted that hundreds from around the world will be participating in these three lectures. Let me give you a warm welcome. Our topic is to find a path to a progressive future. We'll define that along the way, our own perceptions of that, but it is to find a path to a future that is socially inclusive, just, environmentally sustainable, with the decent lives for all people. And both Professor Unger and I believe that we're not on that course right now. Indeed, in the two countries that we'll focus on, in Brazil and the US, we are in outright crisis in many deep ways, crises of inequality, of social and political polarization, of massive disruptions of work, of innovations that are at once promising, but also extremely dangerous, and that could be inclusive, but are actually exclusive, and building huge inequities of power and wealth. We'll try to understand these themes in both a general global perspective, and also with the focus, especially in the next lecture and the one that follows, on the two cases of Brazil and the United States. Today, we're going to discuss the background, what happened to progressive policies, what is the dynamic, or what are the dynamics that are the underlying forces shaping global developments and national developments. I'm going to start with about 20 minutes of a quick overview. It's very quick because I want to cover roughly 70 years of the world scene. That is roughly from 1950 until today, from the period just after World War II until today, and make some broad observations. I'm going to have to even start further back, roughly 200 or 250 years ago at the start of the industrial era to tell the story, but it will be very, I hope, quick, to the point, and useful for some background. So I'm going to put a PowerPoint on the screen for all of us to look at. You're looking at an iconic picture of the steam engine, which indeed will be the starting point for discussion for me. So today we want to talk about stagnant and divided, what happened to socially inclusive economic growth and progressive politics. And I will start out with the steam engine. I'm an economist, and I would say mostly a materialist, believing that fundamental drivers of societal change have been technological to a remarkable extent. Of course, ideas and institutions both drive technological change and use them in one way or another. So the interplay of ideas, power, technology are all deeply relevant. But without the technological changes, we would not have the shape of the world that we have. And I regard the steam engine as the most decisive technological change since agriculture, because it created the industrial world. It unleashed a period of 220 years, roughly, of dramatic economic change, what we measure as economic growth, and a world of profound inequalities as well, because some parts of the world harnessed the new technologies more effectively than others. Some parts of the world succumbed to power from the early industrializers, and European imperial rule was one of the consequences of the earlier industrialization that took place in Europe. Well, the steam engine changed everything about economic history. This is a well-known figure estimating world output over the 2 millennia. And not much happened in the world economy in aggregate production for 1,800 of the 2,000 years of the 2 millennia of the Common Era. Suddenly the curve shoots upward, and that starts around 1800. And I would argue, though I won't argue at length right now, that it started with the harnessing of coal energy, which broke free of what historians call the organic economy, the kind of economy that was limited to animal traction and human labor, and what could be gained in energy from growing feed grains and food grains, and a little bit of wind and water power thrown into the mix. But the steam engine led to massive, rapid economic growth for the first time in human history. But it led to hugely unequal development, because industrialization itself started in England with the invention of the steam engine by James Watt and its commercialization. With the ample coal reserves of England, it spread to Western Europe and to the United States in the first half of the 19th century. There was no industrialization in the rest of the world until the late 19th century. Japan was the first industrializing nation of Asia after the Meiji Restoration in 1868, which put Japan on a path of industrialization. China not only did not industrialize, but it fell victim to European and then Japanese imperialism because it was a late industrializer, even though it was a leading civilization in most of human history. China did not industrialize. Britain began the effective conquest or dominance over China in the first Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842. And then came the Second Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion, and then the increasing encroachments of power of the Western imperial powers, then the war with Japan in 1895. It was a long, bad, difficult history, but China did not industrialize until really after the founding of the People's Republic of China, which was 1949. So we have a world that took off in industrialization, but remarkably unevenly. And that remarkable unevenness also led to the greatest divergence in military power, as well as in economic power in human history, and gave Europe and then the United States really the power to impose its will on much of the rest of the world. That's the starting point for our world today. During the period from 1820 to 1950, the share of the world economy being produced outside of what I call the North Atlantic region, which is Europe and the US, the share taking place in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa declined markedly. That's what's shown in this graph. The share outside of the North Atlantic fell from about 65% in 1820 to no more than 30% by the end of World War II. So this was the North Atlantic made industrial world, the North Atlantic imperial world. And the rest of the world was mostly victim and assigned the role of providing the raw materials for the industrial North Atlantic world. Then came the two world wars, and between 1947 and the 1970s, essentially the end of colonialism almost everywhere. And that unleashed, for the first time, the possibility of economic growth in the former colonial regions. Up until that time, they couldn't even implement education programs. It was only with independence from European power that most of the rest of the world was able to begin a process of economic development. And what you see here is a huge historical change. That is, starting around 1950, a process of convergence begins where technology spreads beyond the North Atlantic to the rest of the world. And most notably for our time, China began to catch up dramatically with the rest of the world once it was freed from the yoke of imperial controls. This was especially true after 1978, because the first decades of the People's Republic were tumultuous. But with 1978, the end of a very difficult period of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping created a framework of governance that enabled China to massively increase its productivity in all spheres, and actually over a period of about 40 years to end extreme poverty in China. Quite a remarkable accomplishment. But if you take a look at this U-shaped graph, for about 150 years of industrialization, the North Atlantic became more and more powerful. From 1950 onward, we've had a period of convergence, broadly speaking, although, again, very uneven, because different parts of the world have had different economic experiences. Now, I want to emphasize the underpinnings of this global growth, especially from the 1950s onward, because I think it's key to this story of division, both within countries and between countries. Starting with the Industrial Revolution, but especially with World War II and its aftermath, the economies of the leading countries became more and more science-based. And just as one indicator, I have here the share of research and development spending in the US economy from 1953 to 2017, just a slide from the National Science Foundation. What you can see is the rising share of the national economy spent on research and development. In fact, the red line is the research and development share of the private sector. The yellow curve and line is the R&D of the public sector. This has been, to an important extent, a science-based economic growth spurred by public funding, but then taken by private business with massive ownership and market capitalization of information and technology and intellectual property rights. And that has been the basic driver of continued economic growth in the high-income countries, science and technology based. And one of the implications of that is a massive change of the employment structure as well. What is shown here from 1950 to 2015 is the share of total jobs in 4 different classifications. The managerial and professional class, which is in blue, the production workers, which is in agriculture, mining, construction, and manufacturing, and the jobs in services and sales, which are the lower 2 lines. The big change sociologically and economically in the United States, you can see, is the rise of the managerial and professional class and the relative decline of the production class. This, in my view, speaking very briefly to this point, is the nature of science and technology-led development, that it is congenial to certain kinds of work, those with high educational attainment and particular professional skills that work alongside the machines. Whereas this same technological development displaced much of the working class. And so the share of workers in production activities on the assembly line or in the mines or in agriculture or in construction declined from almost 60% of employment to 1/4 of employment. Well, that's a huge gap that opened up economically between the professional class and the producing occupations, mainly in construction, manufacturing, and primary commodities. It's also a sociological and political divide that opened up as well. What happened is that the demand in the marketplace, measured as earnings of workers with bachelor's or higher degrees, saw incomes rise during this period because the technological demands called for more and more of the professional skills, whereas the workers who were replaced by the machines, the workers that succumbed to automation on the assembly line, now to e-commerce and to autonomous mining and mechanization in agriculture, saw their wages decline. We have ended up, therefore, with a huge economic divide in our societies that has opened an unprecedented income inequality. Where does that income inequality come from? It comes in two ways. The owners of intellectual property, which are given monopoly rights by the patent system, have soared in wealth. And this we have seen also during the COVID-19 pandemic, that the wealth of the richest people in the world has gone up by trillions of dollars in the last 2 years, whereas the frontline workers in the brick and mortar economy have lost their jobs, lost their incomes, and suffered terrible declines of livelihoods. So there's been a huge shift of income towards intellectual property and towards professional workers, whereas assembly line workers and workers in the brick and mortar retail sector, in agriculture, in mining, and so forth, have seen declining employment and stagnant or falling wages. When that inequality opens up, governments have choices. Or let me not put it that way. Let me say that political systems may or may not respond, or may respond in differing ways. Does that widening income inequality lead to a political response to try to transfer income from the rich towards the poor? Or does it lead to a political response that exacerbates the income inequality by giving even more political power to the rich and depriving the poor of that margin of political power? Well, countries have differed markedly in that. In the United States, it has been the case that during this era of widening inequality that I believe is driven fundamentally by technological change, politics has weighed more and more on the side of the wealthy. So it's become more oligarchic, less democratic during this 40-year or 50-year or 60-year period, depending on your start date. And so we've had high inequality driven by technological change, amplified by political change. Whereas in the social democratic countries of Northern Europe, it is fair to say that similar inequalities in the marketplace were met by resistance or offsetting forces politically of high levels of redistribution. The share of government in the economy rose markedly in the last 50 years in Northern Europe, not in the United States, for example. So the claim that I'm making is that change, even from 1800 onward, has been technologically paced. Of course, how that technological change feeds through to real lives depends on politics. For 150 years, industrialization led to misery outside of the industrial countries because it led to imperial power and imperial rule. That began to change after World War II. Within countries, the same technological change that became even more science-based after World War II favored a certain class. I'm privileged to be in that class, lucky to be in that class, because workers like myself who have PhDs have had a strong labor market demand, and the technological revolution has been a friend, not a foe in that way. But many have suffered, and our political structures have amplified that suffering in the United States, something that we will discuss and look at in the next lecture. Let me just note in the end that the world has very different levels of inequality. This is a key question for us. The United States is not the most unequal place in the world, but it is much less equal than Canada or in Western Europe, where you see the green shades, which means low inequality. The countries in red have the highest measured inequality, the highest Gini coefficients. And we can see that in general, Brazil is, of course, among the most unequal countries in the world, the United States the most unequal among the high-income countries of the world. So let me stop by summarizing the main points that I would like to put on the table as a background for our analysis. First, modern economic growth is driven by technological change. Second, the North Atlantic countries industrialized first, and those countries actually hindered industrialization in the rest of the world through their imperial dominance. Catching up growth began after the end of imperial rule, which means after the end of World War II. Post-1950 growth worldwide has increasingly been science-based and education favored. The professional class, as a result, has soared in number and in income relative to the rest of society. Inequality has widened in all parts of the world, but has been partially offset by fiscal redistribution in the social democracies, not in the United States. And this poses a major question of the relation of politics to economy, a topic that we're going to be discussing in detail in these three lectures. Let me stop there, and it's a pleasure to turn it over to you, Roberto.
This is a seminar about alternatives. In a world that is bent under the yoke of a dictatorship of no alternatives. For some time now in the rich North Atlantic world, there has been a dominant project of the enlightened elite. And that project can be described as a commitment to reconcile the economic flexibility that has been paramount in the United States with the social protection that has been emphasized in European social democracy, within the framework of a barely adjusted version of the inherited and established institutions. It is my thesis in these discussions of ours that this project has failed, and it must be replaced by an attempt to change the framework. In this circumstance that I'm describing, the progressives, the would-be progressives, appear on the stage of history as the humanizers of the inevitable. Their main effort has been to place a human face on the program of their conservative adversaries, chiefly by resorting to compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer, progressive taxation, and redistributive social entitlements. The origin of this situation lies in the last major moment of institutional and ideological refoundation in the rich countries, what we could describe as the social liberal or social democratic settlement of the mid-20th century, the American counterpart to which was Roosevelt's New Deal. Under the terms of this settlement, the forces that were attempting earlier in the 20th century to reshape more fundamentally the arrangements of power and of production renounced this challenge. And in return, the state was allowed to acquire the power to regulate the economy more intensively, to redistribute retrospectively through progressive taxes and social entitlements, and to manage the economy countercyclically by fiscal and monetary policy. And this project has been carried since the aftermath of the Second World War by the major center-right and center-left parties. Now it has failed. And it has failed in three main ways. First, it has failed to ensure the continuation of broad-based, socially inclusive economic growth. There was a period of 30 years after the Second World War of rapid and broad-based growth, but with few exceptions or interruptions, it has been followed by a slowdown of growth and of the rise of productivity. And a major reason for that slowdown has been, as I will discuss later, the emergence of a new vanguard of production that, rather than being disseminated to the whole economy, has been quarantined, confined in islands that exclude the vast majority of businesses and of firms. The second way in which this program has failed is that it has failed adequately to attenuate inequality rooted in the hierarchical organization of the system of production, and in particular in the deepening chasm between the vanguard and the rear guard, the insular advanced part of production and the vast economic periphery excluded from that vanguard. Now, it is true that the European social democracies have preserved relatively more equality than the United States. They have been relatively more successful in attenuating these inequalities, but with two important qualifications. The first qualification is that compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer has worked only as the epilogue to many decades of struggle in Europe over access to economic and political power. The epilogue doesn't work without the preceding narrative. And the second qualification is that if the disparities become too great, they cannot be contained by retrospective correction through tax and transfer. The correction would have to be massive, so massive that it would begin to disorganize the established economic incentives and arrangements and exact an unacceptable cost in economic efficiency and output. The third way in which this program has failed is that it has failed to ensure the conditions of social cohesion in the advanced societies. Money transfers organized by the state are not a sufficient social cement. They appear to be so long as there was ethnic and cultural homogeneity. But when ethnic and cultural homogeneity are eroded, for example, by migratory flows, the insufficiency of money as a basis of social cohesion becomes manifest. The consequence of this failure of the project of the center-right and center-left parties in the rich North Atlantic world has been the creation of a political vacuum. And into this vacuum has come reactionary populism. It enters the vacuum. The populist movements and leaders have no organized mediation connection between themselves and the masses. It's a personalist, unorganized, liquid leadership. They give non-structural responses to structural problems, and they mask the insufficiency of these non-structural responses, sometimes by exploiting the animosity of ethnic majorities against ethnic minorities, and sometimes by pretending to side with the cultural and religious agenda of the working class majority against the cultural preferences of the elites. But populism is also fragile. It has no economic program other than imposing constraints on migration, and no constitutional program other than strengthening executive authority. So the vacuum continues. The right wing, the right of center or left of center establishment may come back to power, but it's likely to come back to power empty-handed. It may have money to distribute, borrowing or printing it for stimulus, as in the emergency now, but it has no structural alternative. So that's our discussion in this seminar. How are we to find a way out of this vacuum, an alternative to both the established social liberal or social democratic program of the mid-20th century and the false populist response to its failure? Now, this brings me to a second story necessary to understand the failure that I've just described. And the second story is about a change in the practice of production. Until relatively recently, the most advanced practice of production used to be industrial mass production, the large-scale production of standardized goods and services on the basis of rigid machines and production processes with semi-skilled labor and very hierarchical and specialized relations of production. That was the economic basis of the program that has failed. Now there emerges in the world a new vanguard of production, which we call the knowledge or innovation economy, with an immense potential, a potential to draw together the activities of production and of scientific discovery, a potential to raise the level of discretionary initiative and reciprocal trust required and allowed of all participants in the process of production, and the potential to loosen or even reverse what up to now has been the most universal constant in economic life, diminishing marginal returns to inputs in production. There is the promise of a form of innovation that is perpetual rather than episodic. But this potential is constrained because the new vanguard of production, although it appears in every sector of the economy, in intellectually dense services and in scientific agriculture, as well as in advanced manufacture, appears in each of them only as a fringe, excluding the vast preponderance of workers and of businesses. The consequences of this insularity are far-reaching. The first consequence is stagnation, slowdown. How could there not be slowdown if the most advanced practice is denied to the largest part of the economy? If most people remain stuck in what is in effect make work in relatively retrograde forms of production. And the second consequence is the aggravation of inequality, an inequality anchored in these structural divisions, in this abyss that opens up between the advanced and backward parts of production. An inequality so great that redistribution by taxes and entitlements is insufficient to master it. There then appears in the world a new dilemma about economic growth and development. The old path to rapid growth was conventional industry. That path is now closed. The former vanguard survives only as the residue of an earlier form of production, or as the satellite to a new vanguard. But what would be the alternative? The alternative would be an inclusive form of the knowledge economy, a knowledge economy for the many, but it doesn't exist. If it doesn't exist, even in the most advanced economies with the most educated populations, how could we expect it to exist in the rest of the world? That is the dilemma that we must break. And we can break it only on the second side, by transforming the seemingly impossible task of developing an inclusive knowledge economy into a feasible one, breaking it up into steps and pieces. Now then, we come to the agenda, the outline, the sketch of a path that would enable us to respond to this vacuum and to this failure, and to find an alternative that would reestablish the basis for socially inclusive economic growth throughout the world. Anticipating the course of our discussion, I suggest that there are three main lines of institutional innovation to explore. The first line is democratizing the market economy to the end of disseminating throughout the labor force and the production system the most advanced productive practice, the knowledge economy for the many that I invoked. There is no single natural and necessary form of the market order. It is not enough to regulate the market or to compensate for its inequalities by retrospective correction. It is necessary to innovate in the institutional arrangements that define the market order. And we can imagine this innovation as advancing in three steps. In the first step, the objective is to expand access to the resources and opportunities of production in favor of the mass of backward firms and of relatively unequipped workers, and to discover what works and to disseminate what works. In the second step, we can imagine the beginnings of a new institutional architecture of the market order. Between governments and firms, a form of strategic coordination or partnership that is decentralized, pluralistic, participatory, and experimental. And among firms, cooperative competition, so that even as they can continue to compete against one another, they can also cooperate, achieving economies of scale. And then in the third stage, much further ahead, the creation of alternative regimes of private and social property that coexist experimentally in the same market order. The market order should not be fastened to a single dogmatic version of itself. The second axis of such a structural alternative is the development of a high-energy democracy, a democracy that does not need crisis to make change possible. A high-energy democracy is a democracy that first elevates the tempo of politics, the temperature of politics, that is, the level of organized popular engagement in political life. Through the form of the electoral regime, the relation between money and politics, the access to the means of mass communication in favor of the political parties and the social movements. In the second place, it is a democracy that accelerates the pace of politics, its tempo, by creating constitutional mechanisms that resolve impasse quickly, and distinguishing the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, which we should uphold, from the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics, which we should repudiate. And the third set of institutional arrangements of a high-energy democracy have to do with the combination of strong central initiative and radical devolution to parts of the country or the society, so that they can experiment with counter models of the national future. A high-energy democracy is the indispensable counterpart to a democratized market order. The third axis is to secure the individual, worker and citizen, in a haven of safeguards and capability ensuring endowments, so that all around him there can rage a storm of innovation and experiment. The most important part of that haven is a new form of education, a form of education both general and technical that accords priority to the analytic and synthetic capabilities of the mind over the mastery of dead information, that prefers selective depth to encyclopedic superficiality, that puts cooperation in teaching and learning in the place of the juxtaposition of authoritarianism and individualism in the classroom, and that approaches every subject dialectically from contrasting points of view, the only way to liberate the mind. Now, what are the forces that can drive such an alternative and help overthrow the dictatorship of no alternatives? First, success in solving the practical problems that the established program has left unsolved. The problems of growth, of inequality, and of cohesion. Improving the life chances of the masses of ordinary men and women. Down below, in the harsh realities of the world, the driving force is the struggle of states for power and prosperity. And up above, there is a spiritual ideal, the most powerful ideal at work in the world today, the enhancement of agency, the ability of the ordinary man and woman to stand up and turn the tables against his or her social circumstance. The enabling condition of the enhancement of agency, of this ideal, is the most important resource in the world. The formless, measureless life that exists in ordinary humanity. Vitality is almost everything, but it is blind and needs an ally to give it eyes. The ally of vitality is the imagination. Jeff, I turn it back to you. You were muted.
Thank you very much. That is the most frequent sentence in the English language. Now you are muted. So I am off mute and really eager to engage. I think that probably a major question is the nature of this failure that of which we share a conception for the United States, for example. And the question is, how generalized is that failure? what does it mean about social democracy, for example, which I continue to admire and espouse, albeit in an updated form for the 21st century. I don't want to idealize any society, but I would say that what we see in the countries of Scandinavia today, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, or the Nordic societies, including Finland and Iceland, have a great deal of what you call for of growth, equality, and inclusion. And it is notable that in those countries, life is socially inclusive. Life expectancy is in the 80s, the highest in the world. Leisure time is shared broadly. Everybody gets many, many weeks of leisure time, which is extremely important for well-being and for replenishment of body and soul. And I think it's not right to say that the idea of social democracy is merely compensatory tax and transfer, though that plays a role. The idea of social democracy, as I understand it, is inclusion, including precisely the kinds of investments universally that you espouse and that I concur in education and in healthcare and in the other kinds of security and rights that you properly call for as the third plank of the future. So I think one issue which we can discuss is the extent to which this failure is a pervasive failure or a particular kind of failure. I regard it much more as a US failure and of other societies as well. But I see features in US culture and society that brought about the end of the New Deal consensus or the social democratic consensus that were distinctive to the United States and not a fundamental failure of the social democratic ideal itself. Of course, social democracy was born in the late 1800s, and it took root in the 1930s. And it was born in the industrial world, not in the post-industrial world. And so there's our important questions about how a 21st century vision of social democratic inclusion should be updated to take into account very different sociologies and structures of our society. And I like many of the suggestions you make, and we'll discuss them about how knowledge and education can be more attuned to our real needs and our possibilities. But I believe that what we're looking at in the US and in Brazil, when we look at it, and in some other countries, is a different set of issues from the ones that you have focused on, which are overwhelmingly on the theory of the economic roots. Though you did say that the failure of social cohesion came about because of ethnic, that the success required ethnic and cultural cohesion, and it was that stress that brought it apart. And there, I think you're putting your finger on something that we need to discuss a lot more. Because to my mind, the history of the United States needs to be understood fundamentally in the context of civil rights and in the context of very deep, longstanding racism, and how that, more than anything else, derailed the New Deal. because I think that the great dividing line in American politics was not the economic failures of the New Deal, but was the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Because the civil rights movement of the 1960s meant that the New Deal would be expanded to the African American population in the United States. And that proved to be unacceptable to the hard racist half of American society. And that, to my mind, is the battle that we continue to fight today. So I think that Trump was something more than an empty populist, a demagogue, and as far as I'm concerned, a psychopath. But I think what he was actually was a familiar voice in American politics, which is the racist tribune of a racist part of American society who was promising that it would not be the African Americans and the immigrants and the Muslims and the Asians who would be the beneficiaries of government. And it was a standard ploy of this part of American society from slavery onward to say we dismantle the central state so that local power can restore white dominance. And that was the story after this. That was the story before the Civil War, the story after the Civil War, the reason that Ronald Reagan endorsed states' rights in 1980, and the motivating factor of Trump. So where I would put the hardest part for society is living together in multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial societies, and having indeed the social democratic ethos, which is an ethos of inclusivity, an ethos of shared capabilities, an ethos of redistribution also as necessary, but not focusing so much on compensatory redistribution as universal inclusion and empowerment. How to do that in societies that are totally warped by the history of conquest, the legacy of slavery, which in the United States was followed by apartheid rule for 100 years, and then by backlash against the civil rights legislation of the 1950s and the 1960s. So to summarize, I don't view social democracy as a failure, but I view it as a challenge. And the biggest challenge is mentality of how diverse societies can have a social democratic ethos, can have an inclusive ethos, can even aspire to the kind of inclusion that you are absolutely rightly calling for. Other smaller points, I don't believe myself, though this is that this is, I think, finer points to debate, that our biggest problem is lack of innovation or stagnation of innovation. We're actually in the midst, of course, of a revolution of innovation. There are problems, to be sure, and the two major problems that you rightly pointed to is innovation, even by design and sometimes by accident, can result in monopolization. And second, innovation does not necessarily diffuse. And the diffusion of innovation, I agree with you, requires a different kind of education as a fundamental point. And the monopoly issue really requires us to rethink the patent system and the way the innovation system works, and the capture of knowledge by small groups by design, and to some extent by the forces of network scale, because all of the digital technologies have network externalities that lead to winner-take-all kinds of structures to them that are detrimental to our well-being in the end. but I don't think that we fundamentally are stuck in innovation. I also do wonder about, I very much agree, by the way, with the idea of the security of the individual in the midst of the storm. And I think that that is the social democratic genius, actually, which is people feel secure even in a fast changing economy, which is a rather remarkable feature. But in the United States, if you lose your job, you lose your health care, you can lose your home, you can lose everything. And that doesn't happen in a social democratic regime. So maybe I'll pause here to say that I think what you are calling general features have a lot of historical specificities to them, but they are widespread features of highly divided societies. And they have a lot of racial backlash to them in a world that is not homogeneous and should not be homogeneous and never has been homogeneous, but was white dominated for a lot of modern history. And there I do see a fundamental question which we need to confront.
So Jeff, there are too many themes there to address. So I'm going to choose just three parts of your remarks to comment on briefly. So first, the universality of the dilemma about the next model of growth. It's not just about the rich North Atlantic world, it's about the whole world. So take my country, which will be one of our two major examples next week, Brazil. We had conventional industry established in the southeast of the country in the mid 20th century. And as generally in the world, it is in decline. It won't come back. Now we found a refuge in the riches of nature. So we export now chiefly to China, untransformed agricultural and ranching products and untransformed mining products. And this easy wealth from nature pays the bills of urban consumption. That's not a national future. Now, what's the alternative? The alternative would be the thing that doesn't exist, the inclusive knowledge economy. It exists only as this set of islands that I described. So somehow we have to find a way to lift up step by step this vast backward periphery of the economic order. Without that, all of the dynamism of the Brazilian people will go to waste. Now, my second observation about historical social democracy, a theme which you and I have discussed before. Let's have an unsentimental view of social democracy. So historically, there were three sets of arrangements. First, there were arrangements that defended the insiders against the outsiders, like insider workers against workers with unstable jobs. Second, there were arrangements that organized social compacts or incomes policies, deals between big business and organized labor orchestrated by the state. And third, there were the high level of redistributive entitlements, paradoxically funded by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption. Now, what's happened? What's happened is that social democracy has been progressively hollowed out, and it's given up the first two sets of arrangements and retreated to the last line of defense, the high social entitlements. And it has been, quote, liberalized, especially in the labor markets, with an increasing part of the labor force consigned to precarious, unstable employment. That's the reality. And these forces of hierarchical segmentation and inequality are advancing there also in the home ground of European historical social democracy. It's no good for American progressives to imagine a mythical Sweden of the 1970s as the answer to their problems. It's mythical because based on many decades of struggle over economic and political power that ended in a compromise between the social democratic states and the plutocratic dynasties that continue to own most of the Swedish economy. That's the reality. We don't need to sentimentalize it. And it is not able to master this new agenda. It has a great achievement, the high level of investment in people and their capabilities, but it doesn't have answers to these structural problems. Now, the third theme, nationalism, unity, cohesion. All the nations in the world are on a path from having been tribes to one or another extent to becoming something else. Experiments in different ways of being human. And along that path, an accident happens. They have to give up parts of their collective identity, their customs. They have to imitate one another. And then the abstract will to difference is aroused as actual difference diminishes. So two nations live side by side and they hate each other, not because they're different, but because they're becoming alike and they want to be different. So what's the solution? The solution of liberal cosmopolitanism is to suppress difference. The real solution is to equip difference, to create the basis to generate new differences, new innovations. And that's the program that I began to outline. And that program is related to something internal to the societies. How do we establish cohesion if cohesion can't rely on sameness? The alternative basis for cohesion is doing things together, the multiplication of forms of collective action. And that's what we want in both the democratized market order and in a high energy democracy.
I agree with you on the idea of equipping difference. I do remind all of us that when that kind of empowerment was politically on the table in the United States, we had a decade of assassinations of leaders who called for exactly that, with Malcolm X and Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King and others who were advocating exactly that. The particular path of racism in the United States, but also not only in the United States, and I'd like to understand more about Brazil, because Brazil was the largest slave-owning society, the last to end slavery. It has had a somewhat different trajectory, but my feeling is that the legacies are still very current and very strong today. The vulgarity of Bolsonaro in the way he speaks about the indigenous peoples also is something absolutely startling and, to my mind, out of the 16th century, not out of the 21st century. But I think the point I would emphasize is that you are absolutely correct, and I think for all of us, we are in trajectories of change in a truly global world. I tend to believe in cosmopolitanism as important. I tend to believe in difference also as something to celebrate and to equip. So I like that idea very much. But I also want to emphasize how much resistance there is in practice and how decisive that was actually in the American context, because we did not have a good faith debate in the United States about equipping difference. We had violence. And the more one is reminded or learns or relearns about American history, the uglier is this underpinning of American history. I'm in the process of finishing one of the great classics, which I had never read before, W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, which is a monumental achievement of a genius, describing how the Civil War, end of Reconstruction, ended up in the effective re-enslavement of African Americans in the United States. But what is striking to me, Roberto, is the unbelievable vulgarity and violence attached to it. There was not an ounce of good faith in the much of the US to protecting African Americans after a civil war that had emancipated slaves. And the legacy of that was an apartheid society. And my claim is that that was also the doom of social democracy in the United States, as Du Bois says, already back in the 1870s, because poor blacks and poor whites could not get together to see themselves part of the same class and same society, but also in the 1960s and onward, because we didn't have a good faith attempt to equip difference. We had an attempt to crush difference once again. So I think that this is part of our very deep difficulties, and we should think about how to address them. On mythical Sweden, I'm probably more for mythical Copenhagen than I am for mythical Stockholm, I have to tell you. Sweden became, I wouldn't say conservative, but definitely it lost some of the social democratic ethos and charm, I would say, in the last 30 years. Like you say, it took on a lot of things that I would not have recommended. Still, compared to the US, it's incredible. But I would say in general, it is not the case that it's mere sentimentality. These are really nice places to live with a high quality of life, very broadly shared. And I think we should appreciate that point.
Jeff, I think it would be good to open up now, right?
Yes.
To the students?
Absolutely. Yes, and please respond to any of that. So I didn't mean to crowd the conversation, but we'll open it up for discussion.
Thank you so much, Jeff and Roberto, for such a comprehensive lecture on this progressive alternative, covering everything from political, economic, education, social issues, and so on. We've been monitoring their very, very vibrant comment and questions, and a really interesting conversation from our participants. You have touched many of these items, covering slavery, colonialism, racism, education, technology, and so on. But I will pick some of these interesting questions, and please continue to comment on our Q&A. So this question comes from Joel Rogers, and it says, what is your view on the promise of urbanization, another huge trend in the world, as a promising way to reconcile this perspective that you're putting on the table?
The promise of what? Could you
urbanization.
Urbanization. Yeah.
Correct. And a more progressive project going forward. Particularly because cities are more, as we know, more productive and more tolerant, and a natural place to construct high quality public goods for residents, he said, and a better environment. And he hopes that we will be more mindful metro sapiens, having a better living better together, but also with nature.
Jeff, would you like to begin there?
I'll just say a word. I think it's a very good question, because the urban milieu really is itself a shaper of our souls, and it is a fundamental global trend. At the start of the Industrial Revolution, when the steam engine first came to being, the share of the world living in urban areas was less than 10%. And now it's estimated at 55% and rising to 70 or 80%. It's not sufficient, obviously. Brazil and the US are highly urban societies and have not overcome the challenges. And Brazilian cities are famous for having a very sharp geographic dividing line that one can see from the sky. And so too American cities. I would say that a lot of our history of the suburban phenomenon in the United States in the 1950s onward is literally the phenomenon of racism in action in the institutions of housing and residential settlement, because American suburbs were designed for white people and they were financed for white people until 1968. The Federal Home Administration, FHA, would only give mortgages to white people, and it blocked developments for mixed or for African American populations. So we actually designed a geography of segregation as a core matter of public policy, even in a favored New Deal program. And that's why I say the 1960s was so decisive, because when the FHA said, okay, we're going to open this up for everybody, then the racist part of American society said, then we don't want this program anymore. And that's when the backlash to the federal government became so powerful.
So this problem of urban planning illustrates a difficulty of method that is pervasive in these programmatic discussions that we are beginning here to have. And the difficulty of method is this: it doesn't make sense to imagine that there'll be a single national, much less worldwide, blueprint for urban plannings. We have to be able to experiment. In generally, with respect to all of these structural problems. So like the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we have reason to recognize the primacy of structural alternatives. But unlike them, we also have reason to resist entrusting our future to dogmatic institutional formulas. So therefore, the state needs to be able to experiment. The state can't experiment just centrally. Different parts of society, of the country, have to be able to experiment separately, to get off the train and to try something else. Now, we know from history that any kind of devolution of power can readily be abused to entrench privilege of some groups of the population against others. Therefore, the devolution has to be qualified or constrained, both politically and judicially, to ensure they will not be abused in this way. But it is indispensable. As opposed to the early 20th century progressivist vision that there is an enlightened technocracy that decides how cities ought to look and then imposes that on the whole country. That's absurd. So the problem is that we recognize intellectually that it's absurd, but we don't have the institutional machinery to escape from dogma, and we need it.
Thank you so much for that. There are a lot of questions regarding education as well, and both as educators, I'm sure you have a lot to say. Just to give you a bit of the context, many people have mentioned STEM education as a very important aspect, but then others have noted that actually it's more education for equity and what type of affordable, quality and universal education is right. So I was interested perhaps that you could say exactly this, right? What is education?
So why don't I begin there and answering that, and I'll say, thinking about the two countries we've chosen as examples, Brazil and the United States. In any society that's very large, very unequal, and federal in structure, as Brazil and the United States are, the threshold practical problem is how to reconcile the local management of the schools by the states and towns with national standards of investment and quality. So we need three mechanisms. We need to know what works, to measure results and performance. Second, we need to have redistributive mechanisms to redistribute resources and staff within the federation. It is intolerable for the finance of the school system to depend on local finance exclusively. And third, we need a corrective procedure. If a local school system fails, it has to be taken over by a cooperation within the federation to fix it and return it fixed. We cannot allow the quality of education the young person receives to depend on the happenstance of where it's born or to whom it's born. Now, that's on the side of the institutional setting, but then there's the pedagogic paradigm which I briefly pointed to, a different kind of education. Now, we have it episodically. In the United States, there was an educational reformer, John Dewey. There's an elite part of the school system that goes somewhat in the direction that I described. But then there's a whole second layer, this vast educational dualism in the United States. We need something completely different and much more radical than what we have. The national curriculums that exist in the world are, for the most part, a kind of infantilization of the university culture. So, you know, in the university, there are these disciplines, and each of them is based on the marriage of a method and a subject matter. So, for example, economics is not the study of the economy, as you might think it would be. It's the study of a method pioneered by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. And so the national curriculums take this backward to the education of children and try to induce them to mistake the dominant ideas for the way things are. So what do we want? We want a form of education that from the very beginning insulates them against intellectual servility, so that they are not delivered emasculated to the higher stages of education. And that's a project, that's a program of national liberation, from the very beginning to form an education for the entire population, not just for some polished elite, that liberates the mind so that they can stand up, so that they can move in the context and move against the context. That's liberation. And educational liberation is the indispensable counterpart to economic and political liberation.
Let me also add that I think that technology, exactly like our course right now, could be part of this liberation, because we really have the means for to reach people in new ways and much more inclusive ways and much lower cost ways also than in the past. And so we should be thinking about how the online world can be transformative and empowering and accessible in very new ways. I'm convinced that it's key for a massive upscaling of our part of our corner of education, which is higher education, where the costs of a university degree are unimaginable in many of our brick and mortar campuses, but the same kind of access and training at a 50th of the cost is possible through using the new technologies. So I think we can be more open, more inclusive, more global, like our classroom today, which is a global classroom. People participating from all over the world gives us an opportunity for doing something different. I also agree completely. We find in the areas of issues like climate change, where we need, first of all, lots of solutions and lots of local action. There is no curriculum in almost all countries in the world that equip young people to become active and problem solvers in this crucial area. And this is a fantastic area, not only because there are basic, crucial parts of knowledge that should be known and mastered, but also because problem solving is intrinsic to this challenge, and every city should be solving problems. Every village should be solving problems on climate change. And I envision students marching with their solutions to the mayor who doesn't know, but to say, this is what we should be doing locally. So I do see ways to do what you're calling for in a new kind of pedagogy. And I would add both the substance area, learning about the big challenges that we face, whether it's climate change, inequality, or global citizenship, living together in tolerance, and participatory learning, which is very different from the normal learning, but I think can be enhanced really by a new technology, a new platform, or new platforms for education. So in this area, we're, I think, completely eye to eye on the need for breakthroughs.
Thank you so much. I just want to say that here there is also a lot of comments around patents and also the open source movement as way that we can be more inclusive, and exactly what you're saying, the use of technology. So this is great. We do have a couple of minutes, and I just wanted to perhaps bring another item that has been a recurrent one, which is sustainable development. And perhaps in this initial session, we're going to dive in more of these questions going on. I'm glad that we have 2 more sessions to go. If you could elaborate a bit more in the link of this progressive project and sustainable development in general and the SDGs in particular.
To the link to what?
To the Sustainable Development Goals.
The Sustainable Development, yeah. So do you want to say something first, Jeff?
Yeah, let me say a word about that. The ethos of sustainable development is that society should be prosperous, inclusive, and environmentally sustainable. So I think it is very much aligned with what we are discussing. Sustainable development as a set of goals specifically adds an emphasis on the environmental catastrophe that is unfolding. And it's very much part of our discussion for Brazil and the United States coming up, because it's not coincidental that both countries do not exactly incorporate the norms of environmental sustainable and in fact, both have resorted to what Professor Unger called, I don't remember exactly the phrase that you used, but the stopgap of turning to nature as the salvation when other things failed.
The refuge.
Yeah, the refuge. So plundering the Amazon or plundering our nature. So we will absolutely come back to these themes in the next lecture.
Yeah, so let me make just two brief comments about this very large subject. So the first is that a sustainable form of production is either primitive or very advanced. There's nothing in between. And that fact is often not appreciated. So a Green New Deal, a project of sustainable growth, is inseparable from the agenda of deepening and disseminating the knowledge economy. The second comment is this: there is a tendency within the rich North Atlantic world to represent ecological politics, the environmental agenda, as a kind of post-structural or post-ideological form of political activity. And the premise is this: history has disappointed us, all these calamities of the 20th century. So we will drown our sorrows in the great garden of nature, like a park. But that's not how we should think of this theme of sustainability, not as a way out from the struggles over structure, but as an invitation to retake them and reimagine them in another form. And that is very concretely presented, for example, in the Amazon in my country. We have 25 million people living and working there. It's not going to be a park. And so we have to have a different way of understanding the relation between the urban, industrial, technological complex and the green complex in a form that ensures that the forest standing will be worth more than the forest cut down. And then there's a whole world to develop of technological links between the urban and the forest, of technical links, the environmental services, of economic links, the intermediate stages, and of legal links, property regimes that will allow us to manage that vast territory larger than Western Europe by some means other than just conceding the land to large businesses. So this is a large task of invention. It's not a diversion into a theme park. It's part of the reconstruction of society.
Wonderful.
Thank you so
Florencia, guide us to our next session together.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're at the end of the hour, but we're lucky that we have 2 more sessions on the 26th next week, as well as on the 2nd of April. So please stay with us. You will receive at the end of the webinar a link with the recordings. They're going to be both at the YouTube channel of SCSN as well as the SDG Academy Library, and the link to register for the next 2 sessions. Thank you so much again, Professor Sachs and Roberto Mangabeira Unger, for such a wonderful class and for sharing this, so your valuable expertise on such an important and current topic. And thanks everyone. Thanks so much to our audience for staying with us.
Thank you all.
Thank you, and see you next week.
Bye. Thank you.